The room erupted into thunderous applause as Charlotte Evans stepped onto the sleek, modern stage of a Chicago tech convention center, the LED lights catching the gleam of her golden locket, a keepsake from her father. Towering screens behind her displayed flashing clips of their company's breakthrough AI platform. Then came the voice that shifted the entire atmosphere. Mr. Nathan Briggs, the company's magnetic CEO, raised his champagne glass and declared, "If Charlotte pulls this off, not only will she earn a massive raise, but she'll be our next director of strategic innovation. You have my word." Charlotte's pulse raced, and tears threatened the edges of her vision. For the first time in years, she thought, maybe this is it, maybe I'm finally seen. Just 7 months earlier, she was merely a data scientist buried in spreadsheets and forgotten ideas at Cortex Analytics, a mid-size firm in the Midwest. Her workspace? A cubicle tucked between the breakroom and an old server closet. But when the opportunity to pitch a revolutionary AI solution to Zenith Systems, a tech giant, landed on her desk, everything changed. It was a chance at a lifetime deal. But only if she could pull off a near-impossible 6-month turnaround. And she said yes, without hesitation. If you had told Charlotte Evans she'd be at the center of the company's most high-stakes project, she would have laughed, tired and jaded from years of being overlooked. But everything changed the day Mr. Nathan Briggs summoned her to the 32nd floor corner office. That morning, the skyline stretched in silver streaks across the city's frozen glass, and Charlotte's breath fogged the elevator mirror as she tried to compose herself. She thought she was being let go. Nathan didn't even look up at first. He was tapping a Mont Blanc pen against his teeth, his expression unreadable. "Charlotte," he finally said, "you've always been underestimated. Let's change that." He slid a confidential file across the desk. Inside were the specs for Zenith Systems, a multi-billion-dollar player in consumer tech, seeking an advanced AI model that could revolutionize user behavior forecasting. The stakes? A $20 million contract over 5 years, unprecedented for Cortex Analytics. But the timeline? Brutal. The prototype had to be ready in 6 months. Normally, it would take 2 years. Minimum. No one else wants to touch this, Nathan admitted, leaning back in his leather chair. Too risky. Too many ways to fail. But I think you've got the guts for it. Charlotte didn't flinch. "I'll do it." From that moment on, her world shifted. No more casual lunches. No more idle Friday chit-chat. She began working 15-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the couch in the data lab. She hand-picked a small team, analysts, developers, designers, people others had ignored just like her. They were underdogs, overlooked, and they were hungry. Together, they built something breathtaking. Each week brought new challenges, corrupted data, hardware failures, budget constraints, and endless layers of corporate red tape. But Charlotte led with steel in her spine. She convinced skeptical execs to sign off on experimental methods. She negotiated directly with Zenith's tech officers, holding her ground when they pushed for impossible features. She even flew cross-country to defend the project before Zenith's advisory board when Nathan suddenly couldn't make it. For the first time in her life, Charlotte felt unstoppable, not because she had power, but because she had purpose. The team's work paid off. By month 5, the AI prototype not only functioned, it surpassed benchmark goals by nearly 40%. The model could predict customer engagement with such accuracy that Zenith's CTO called it almost prophetic. Charlotte's name started appearing in internal emails from departments she didn't even know existed. And then came the gala. Cortex's 15th anniversary gala was held in a glittering downtown ballroom, chandeliers swinging from the high ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Charlotte was ushered backstage, then onto the platform where applause thundered and confetti cannons exploded. The prototype had won. They beat out 2 Fortune 500 competitors. The deal was signed that very afternoon. When Nathan took the mic, his voice echoed with pride. "Innovation is in our blood," he said, "but there's one person here who redefined what it means to lead." He looked straight at her. Charlotte Evans. Gasps, cheers, even whistles. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of every late night, every ignored email, every time she'd been underestimated. Her hand instinctively clutched the golden locket around her neck. A gift from her late father who told her, "Don't wait for a seat at the table. Build your own table." Nathan's voice rose. "If Charlotte succeeds, and I believe she will, she'll earn double her salary. And she will be our new director of strategic innovation." He lifted his glass. "Mark my words." The room roared. Her coworkers patted her on the back. A few even teared up. Her manager, Jillian Torres, who once barely acknowledged her in meetings, clinked glasses and winked. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt undeniable, seen, valued. Finally, that night, back in her small apartment overlooking the L tracks, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot across the hardwood floor, replaying the moment in her head again and again. She imagined paying off her mother's mortgage, taking a real vacation, Italy. Maybe, not just Motel 6 and gas station snacks. She opened her laptop and began organizing the final project documentation. Charts showing a 37% reduction in cost overruns. Internal workflow reports. User feedback from Zenith's beta testers. Even personal emails from Zenith's VP of Engineering praising her leadership. That weekend, she barely left her apartment. She built a binder the size of a phone book, color-coded and tabbed to perfection. She titled it, "Deliverables and Strategic Outcomes, Zenith Initiative." At the very top, she taped a note her father had written her in college. "Don't wait to be given what you've already earned." On Monday morning, she received a calendar invite that made her chest tighten. Subject: Post-project recognition meeting, executive leadership plus Charlotte Evans. This was it, the real moment, the promise fulfilled. She arrived at work early, wearing a sharp navy blazer and heels that clicked like applause down the hallway. Her locket bounced lightly against her chest, a steady reminder of the promise made on stage. But when she walked through the office, the atmosphere had changed. The smiles were forced. Some of her coworkers avoided eye contact. Jillian didn't even look up from her monitor. The woman who had called Charlotte a rising star at the gala now barely nodded. Her stomach tightened. Still, she kept walking. The executive boardroom was cold and sterile. Nathan sat at the head of the table, scrolling on his phone. Other execs trickled in, nodding but not smiling. Charlotte placed her binder in front of her and said confidently, "Good morning." No one responded. Nathan finally looked up. "Let's begin." What followed was a blur. Empty praise. Phrases like, "team effort," "collective spirit," and "we all played a part." Then came the envelopes, one for each team member. Charlotte opened hers. Inside was a 5-day Caribbean cruise voucher. Her throat tightened. "That's it?" she wanted to ask, but her voice caught. Nathan smiled, cool and condescending. "You deserve a break. Enjoy the sun." She sat frozen, staring at the voucher. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the title. It was the erasure. The erasure of everything she had built, sacrificed, endured. They had used her when it mattered, then pushed her aside when it was time to give credit. The room emptied, and as she gathered her untouched binder, she heard it, 2 execs whispering outside the glass wall. Did she really think they'd make her a director? Please, she's not exactly their type. The words sliced sharper than any insult. Charlotte didn't cry. She didn't storm out. She stood, placed the binder under her arm, and walked out quietly, head high, spine straight. If they weren't going to open the door, she would stop knocking. She was going to build her own. The following morning, Charlotte Evans walked into the Cortex Analytics headquarters with the silence of a storm gathering offshore. There was no banner waiting, no handshakes. The few smiles she did receive were brittle and hollow, like they were scared to be seen siding with her. Jillian didn't even glance up from her desk. For the first time in her career, Charlotte realized something bone deep. The applause had never been for her. It had been for the idea of her. A clean image, a convenient narrative, a temporary mascot of innovation. She passed the break room where leftover balloons from the gala sagged against the walls. The cake was gone, but the emptiness remained. Later that day, she received another calendar invite. Subject: HR Touchpoint, Career Trajectory Discussion. Participants: Jillian Torres, Nathan Briggs, Charlotte Evans. Location: Conference Room B. Duration: 20 minutes. 20 minutes. She read the subject line again, her stomach hardening. This wasn't a reward. It was a pacifier. Or worse, a checkmark. Charlotte declined the invite. Instead, she began building a war chest. No tantrums. No dramatic LinkedIn posts. Just quiet, relentless precision. She combed through archived emails, memos, Slack messages, every digital breadcrumb that confirmed she had been the project's lead architect from day one. Screenshots of timestamps, executive notes praising her, signed approvals, contracts referencing her name, not the director's, not Nathan's. She backed it all up into a private, encrypted drive, and she kept working as if nothing had changed. The real power, she realized, wasn't in the title they withheld, it was in what she knew. Meanwhile, whispers began to surface, overheard in a hallway. Zenith might be pulling out of Phase 2. Leadership concerns. That's what I heard. Charlotte pretended not to listen. But her pulse quickened. Leadership concerns. That night, her phone buzzed. It was a former colleague, now a mid-level project manager at Zenith. The text was simple. Hey, are you okay? Things seem off on your end. She didn't reply right away. But when she did, it was direct. I'm fine. Are you guys reconsidering the rollout? Only if certain people stay in charge. People at the top. A pause. You're not the problem, Charlotte. You're the reason we said yes. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rush of something she hadn't felt since the gala. Validation. And this time, it wasn't performative. It was real. The next morning, an article surfaced online. Anonymous. Razor sharp. Title: The Cost of Betrayal, When Innovation Becomes Exploitation. It didn't mention Cortex by name. It didn't need to. Anyone in the industry could connect the dots. The story detailed how rising talent, especially women in tech, were used as figureheads and then quietly buried when the spotlight faded. It exposed how recognition was replaced with token gestures, how executives reaped the rewards while others were left behind. It went viral in 2 days. Internal Slack channels at Cortex buzzed with theories. Is it about us? Did someone leak something? Why does it feel so familiar? Nathan called an emergency town hall to reassure employees. We stand by our values. Charlotte stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching him sweat. She didn't write the article, but she knew exactly which journalist had received the carefully curated trail of evidence. She also knew which mid-tier Zenith employee had quietly confirmed every word. She had changed the battlefield. A week later, her phone rang again. This time, it was Elena Ramsey, Senior VP of Strategic Initiatives at Zenith. Hi Charlotte, we're requesting a meeting. A private one. Not with Nathan, not with your director. With you. Charlotte's breath caught. Elena, I'll be blunt. Elena interrupted. We don't trust your leadership team anymore. The project was yours. You built it. You sustained it. If we continue with Phase 2, we want you at the helm. If that's not possible, we'll reevaluate the entire partnership. That same afternoon, everything changed. People who had ghosted her began flooding her inbox. Hey, Charlotte, coffee soon? Would love to hear your insights. Let's catch up. Jillian showed up at her desk with a tight smile. So sorry for the confusion last week. Things got lost in translation. Let's talk growth trajectory. It would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Charlotte said nothing. She just nodded and sipped her coffee. The next day, Nathan Briggs called her into his office. The room was quiet, the air brittle. Charlotte, he began, there's been some reflection. He adjusted his cufflinks, eyes shifting. Perhaps the recognition you received wasn't equal to your contribution. She waited. We're offering you a raise. He continued. And a new title, Senior Project Manager. Plus, we'll draft a public memo acknowledging your leadership in the Zenith rollout. Charlotte looked at him with a calm so sharp it could cut glass. I appreciate the offer, she said. He exhaled, visibly relieved. But I already have other plans. His face paled. You're leaving? She stood. I'm not asking anymore. That afternoon, she submitted her resignation. No drama, no theatrics. A clean, concise note delivered via HR. Effective immediately. I resign from my position at Cortex Analytics. Thank you for the lessons. Charlotte Evans. By the time the email hit inboxes, she was already sitting in the boardroom at her new office across town, Chief Innovation Officer at a direct competitor. Zenith Systems followed her there. The partnership was transferred within the month. Charlotte Evans used to believe in systems. In order. In process. In climbing the ladder the right way, quietly, diligently, respectfully. She believed that if you delivered excellent work, kept your head down, and played fair, eventually the people in charge would notice. That they'd reward you. She no longer believed that. Not after what she'd seen behind the polished glass walls and empty promises of Cortex Analytics. Not after being paraded on stage like a poster child for innovation. Only to be discarded like yesterday's marketing slogan once the cameras stopped flashing. Now, her worldview had shifted. At her new office, modern, airy, humming with quiet focus, Charlotte sat in her own corner office. Not as a token, not as a pawn, but as Chief Innovation Officer of Valence Tech, the rising star in enterprise AI solutions. A company that saw her worth and didn't need a public performance to acknowledge it. From her window, she could see the skyline, same city, different altitude. It reminded her of how little had changed outside, and how much had changed within. She no longer sought approval. She no longer craved validation. She owned her value now. In her first few weeks at Valence Tech, she worked with laser focus. She restructured the development pipeline, implemented new efficiency metrics, and launched 2 side initiatives that impressed Zenith Systems so thoroughly. They doubled their planned investment. But the biggest change wasn't in what she did, it was how she did it. She no longer apologized for being direct in meetings. She no longer shrank to fit anyone's comfort zone. She no longer gave away credit that was rightfully hers. She still wore the golden locket her father had given her. But now, it didn't feel like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It felt like a symbol of a battle fought and won. One morning, about a month into her new role, Charlotte received an email marked confidential from Zenith's strategy director. Subject: Internal leadership feedback request, Cortex Analytics. Charlotte, we've heard troubling rumors about the former Cortex team. You're under no obligation to respond. But if you're willing to share your experience with Nathan Briggs and the team, we'd value your insight. Off the record, she read the email twice. It would have been easy to unload. To scorch the earth with receipts. With indignation. With every piece of buried truth. But Charlotte didn't need revenge anymore. She had already won. Instead, she typed a measured response. Thank you for your trust. I'll share only this. Organizations that rely on borrowed brilliance tend to implode under the weight of their own ego. I'm fortunate to now work in a place that values substance over spectacle. She clicked send, then closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. A small, satisfied smile tugged at her lips. She didn't need to burn them down. They were already crumbling, and the industry had noticed. Over the next few weeks, job boards began showing unexpected openings at Cortex. High-level ones. Rumors swirled. Nathan had taken an indefinite leave. A board investigation was underway. Clients were leaving. Zenith had officially terminated the $20 million contract, citing leadership misalignment and ethical concerns. Cortex's stock value plummeted. Shareholder meetings turned into interrogations. And Charlotte? She became the keynote speaker at a major innovation summit. She stood on stage, not for someone else's ego. Not to be used, but to share real knowledge. Her speech was titled, When Systems Fail. Why Reinventing the Ladder Matters More Than Climbing It. She spoke of silent contributors, of unacknowledged labor, of how some of the brightest minds were suffocated in the name of culture fit. And most of all, she spoke of rebuilding from the ashes of betrayal, not with bitterness, but with clarity, boundaries, and self-worth. Afterward, a line of young professionals waited to talk to her. I was you once, one woman said with tears in her eyes. Now I know I'm not crazy. Thank you. Another handed her a business card. If you're ever hiring, I'll follow you anywhere. Charlotte tucked the card into her pocket. Heart full. Something had shifted, not just inside her, but around her. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a catalyst. A few days later, Charlotte walked past her old building on accident, on the way to lunch with a Zenith executive. The once busy lobby sat dim and quiet. The signage had been removed. The glass doors reflected only silence. She paused for a moment, fingers brushing her locket, not with sadness, not with bitterness, but with certainty. They had tried to bury her, but they hadn't realized she was a seed. And now she was in full bloom. 3 months into her new role at Valence Tech, Charlotte Evans was no longer surviving, she was leading. Not out of necessity, not out of spite, but out of vision. A vision that had finally found fertile ground to grow. It started with a single phone call. Charlotte, this is Luis Nakamura, Global Innovation Lead at Eon Nexus. I saw your keynote last week at the summit in Boston. You don't know it yet, but we've been following your work for a while. Charlotte sat up straighter. Eon Nexus wasn't just another tech company. They were a future maker, leaders in quantum computation, neural simulation, and cutting-edge biotech integration. We've got something bold in development, Luis continued, and I think you're the only one who can bring it to life. The next week, Charlotte flew to San Francisco. The Eon Nexus campus looked more like a sci-fi utopia than a tech firm, sunlit labs. Architecture made of recycled smart glass, and conference rooms shaped like neurons. Luis met her in a skybridge overlooking the Pacific. His tone was calm, but urgent. We're building an AI that doesn't just respond to data, it interprets emotion. Context, bias, not just machine intelligence, machine empathy. We call it Project Lumiere. Charlotte's breath caught. It was exactly the kind of work she'd dreamed of before she was shoved into backroom modeling projects and brushed aside for being too young, too assertive, or not leadership material. This wasn't a fix, it was a frontier. Luis smiled. We need someone who can bridge hard science with human behavior. Someone with the guts to tell the truth, even when it's unpopular. Your name kept coming up. Charlotte didn't hesitate. I'm in. What followed was the most demanding, mind-expanding, and exhilarating 6 months of her career. At Valence Tech, she remained the Chief Innovation Officer. But she negotiated a joint partnership that gave her a dual seat, oversight of Project Lumiere at Eon Nexus, while remaining the innovation strategist at her core company. It was unheard of in traditional tech circles. But Charlotte didn't care for tradition anymore. She was rewriting the rules. Project Lumiere assembled some of the brightest minds in the world. Neuroscientists from Berlin, AI ethicists from Montreal, behavioral economists from Singapore. Charlotte led cross-functional teams across 3 time zones, designing neural training modules that mimicked empathy responses and ethical reasoning frameworks. And it wasn't just theoretical. Their prototype could detect the emotional intent behind user decisions with 89% accuracy. In test cases, Lumiere could flag dangerous misinformation before it spread, not by censoring, but by contextualizing and rephrasing the information into constructive dialogue. It was a revolution. Investors noticed. The press noticed. And yes, Zenith Systems noticed. They returned to the table, not just as partners, but as collaborators. One afternoon, as Charlotte stood in a sleek Nexus lab watching Lumiere parse real-time crisis data, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not just the relief of being seen, but the strength of standing in her full self without compromise. No manipulation, no backroom deals, no recognition meetings. Just purpose. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old colleague from Cortex. Just saw your interview on TechFront. I still remember how they sidelined you. You inspire the hell out of me. P.S. I finally left too. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, you don't have to become who they told you to be. You just have to become who you really are. Welcome to the other side. That night, as Charlotte walked through the quiet city streets, golden light bouncing off the windows, she thought about how easily things could have gone another way. If she had stayed silent. If she had accepted the cruise voucher. If she had let the betrayal define her instead of fuel her. But she hadn't. And now, standing under a full moon with the sea wind in her hair and the golden locket warm against her chest, she whispered something only the stars could hear. Thank you for closing that door. It made me build something better. Because sometimes, the greatest opportunities don't come wrapped in applause or offered with champagne. Sometimes, they rise from the wreckage, quiet, determined, and burning bright with everything you've always been. Before everything changed, Charlotte Evans used to ask for permission. Permission to lead. Permission to speak. Permission to dream bigger than the box she'd been placed in. But now, she no longer waited. 6 months into Project Lumiere, Charlotte found herself walking into a leadership summit in Copenhagen. Not as a guest, not even as a keynote, but as the facilitator of a global AI ethics panel. Among her peers were CEOs, academic legends, and government officials. And yet, when she spoke, the room listened, not because she raised her voice, but because her voice now carried authority. Grounded not in power, but in principle, she had become someone new. Not reinvented, but revealed. This version of Charlotte no longer second-guessed her instincts. She no longer filtered herself for fear of being too much. She had grown into a leader who built space for others, instead of fighting to squeeze into someone else's. But her growth wasn't just professional, it was personal, too. One evening, after a 12-hour Lumiere sprint, she sat quietly on her apartment balcony overlooking the city. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to reflect, not just on what she'd gained, but on what she'd survived. The betrayal, the dismissal, the silence after the applause. And yet, she no longer felt bitterness. Only clarity. The Charlotte of the past had tied her worth to the promises of others. She had clung to the validation of people who benefited from her silence. But this new Charlotte understood. Her worth had never been negotiable. It wasn't defined by titles or raises or who clapped when she walked on stage. It was defined by the way she kept moving, even when no one clapped at all. She began mentoring others, quiet voices in loud rooms, young women afraid to speak up, immigrants navigating unfamiliar corporate hierarchies, neurodivergent coders dismissed for being too unconventional. She didn't teach them how to fit in. She taught them how to stand out, without apology. And she didn't just mentor quietly. She institutionalized it. Charlotte helped launch a shadow-to-strategy pipeline inside Valence Tech, where junior staff could pitch major ideas to the executive board without going through layers of red tape. Within 4 months, 2 interns had their prototypes greenlit for funding. "You gave me oxygen," one of them told her through tears. "I didn't even know I was allowed to breathe." That's when Charlotte realized her true growth wasn't measured in deals or titles, but in how many locked doors she could help others open. Meanwhile, Project Lumiere continued to exceed expectations. Global regulators reached out to collaborate. Universities began designing ethics curriculums around its framework. One news outlet even dubbed her the empath engineer. The old her would have laughed nervously at that headline. But now, she stood with both feet planted and said, "Good, let's build empathy into the code, not just the culture." Still, not every day was easy. There were moments when imposter syndrome whispered from the shadows. When she walked into legacy boardrooms filled with men 3 decades older. Some still saw her as the tech girl, or the diversity speaker. But she didn't shrink anymore. She'd look them in the eye, lean in, and say, "You invited me here because you need what I see. Let's not waste time pretending otherwise." And they'd listen, because beneath her calm, there was steel, not aggression, but conviction. That, Charlotte realized, was her greatest transformation. She didn't just believe in herself, she believed in her impact. One rainy morning, her mother called. They hadn't spoken in weeks. The moment she heard her voice, something warm unlocked in Charlotte's chest. "Me thay con tren tivi roy," her mother said in Vietnamese, voice cracking. "Ka na hang zom kung zem. Me tu hao lam." Charlotte wiped away a tear, smiling through the ache. All those nights her mother had worked double shifts. All those years Charlotte had believed that if she worked hard enough, someone would come and reward her. She now understood. No one was coming. But that didn't mean she had to harden. It just meant she had to lead differently. Empathy was not a weakness. Vulnerability was not a liability. Power didn't have to mean domination. It could mean illumination. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure others knew it, too. That night, standing barefoot in her living room, surrounded by whiteboards, documents, and dried-up coffee mugs, she touched the golden locket at her chest. The same one she once held while waiting for approval from a CEO who couldn't even remember what she had sacrificed. But now, it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a torch. Passed down, carried forward, unstoppable. It was a crisp October morning when Charlotte Evans stood across the street from her old office building. The glass facade that once shimmered with corporate ambition now looked dull and weathered. The oversized Cortex Analytics logo had been removed. Only a faint imprint remained, like a ghost of arrogance past. Behind the tinted windows, Charlotte could see rows of vacant desks and flickering ceiling lights struggling to stay alive. The company had imploded, quietly, but decisively, not from scandal, not from drama, but from truth, a truth they had ignored, a truth she had embodied. She stood there in a camel coat, her golden locket catching the morning light. In her hand was a leather-bound notebook, pages filled with sketches, models, and fragments of her next great idea. She no longer needed an audience. She had become her own stage. A breeze swept down the avenue, carrying with it the smell of fresh coffee and city hustle. And for a long moment, she just stood still, not out of hesitation, but reflection. This is where it broke. This is where I broke. And this is where I rebuilt. Months ago, Charlotte had walked out of those doors humiliated, armed with nothing but her dignity and a drive that no one could see but her. Now, she returned not as a former employee, but as an industry titan. Project Lumiere was being hailed as the most humanistic leap in AI since the invention of natural language processing. Its emotional interpretation framework was being adopted across sectors: education, crisis response, even diplomacy. Governments were calling. Universities were rewriting curricula, and at the center of it all was her. Not just as a creator, but as a voice. Her keynote at the Global Ethics in Tech Forum had trended globally. Not because it was sensational, but because it was real. We cannot build intelligent systems on unintelligent cultures, she had said. You want better algorithms? Start with better intentions. Her words had pierced the room like glass shattering. And in the days that followed, inboxes exploded, not with praise, but with confessions, quiet admissions from professionals across the world. I've been erased too. You told my story. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. But Charlotte didn't build Lumiere for revenge. She didn't rise to prove them wrong. She rose to prove herself right. That she was never too ambitious, never too young, never too much. She was exactly enough. And that truth no longer needed anyone else's permission. As she turned away from the shadow of her past, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from Valence Tech. You've just been named Executive Chair of Innovation Strategy. Below it was another. Lumiere awarded Global AI Breakthrough of the Year. And then a third, unexpected. A message from her former intern at Cortex. One of the few who had believed in her even back then. I just got accepted to MIT Media Lab. I never would have applied if I hadn't seen you fight back. Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes, not out of pain, but purpose. She replied, Go change the world. And when they try to silence you, speak louder. She slipped her phone back into her coat pocket and looked ahead. Her car was waiting to take her to the airport, where she'd fly to Tokyo to meet with a coalition of technologists working on global AI transparency protocols. But for a few more seconds, she allowed herself to savor this moment. She had spent years thinking that the key around her neck would one day unlock their door. But she now knew the truth. It was never their door. It was never meant to be opened. Because she was never meant to walk through someone else's path. She was meant to build her own. Brick by brick, code by code, truth by truth. She took one last glance at the abandoned lobby. Not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a quiet, invincible pride. You could bury the person, but not the power, not the potential, not the purpose. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was becoming everything they said you couldn't be, then helping others do the same. And as Charlotte walked forward, step by deliberate step, into a future only she could see, the sun finally rose behind her. Bright, fierce, and unstoppable, just like her. The greatest lie we're taught in corporate life is that success is something granted, from managers, from systems, from someone sitting in a higher office with a nicer chair. But Charlotte Evans learned the truth the hard way. Success is never granted. It's claimed. It's built in silence, earned in resilience, and protected by unshakable self-worth. When she was overlooked, betrayed, and dismissed, Charlotte didn't crumble. She recalibrated. She didn't scream for justice. She became undeniable. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the door we fight to open isn't locked, it just isn't ours to walk through. And that's okay, because some of us aren't meant to fit into systems, we're meant to rebuild them. You don't need permission to rise. You only need the courage to keep walking when no one is clapping. In the end, your value doesn't come from a title. It comes from who you become when no one's watching. If you've ever been overlooked at work, undercredited for your ideas, or made to feel like your ambition is a threat, you are not alone. The workplace can often reward politics over potential. But your value is not defined by a promotion someone promises. It's defined by your ability to pivot with power when you're denied. Start documenting your work. Build relationships beyond your direct circle. Develop your skills outside of your job description. And most importantly, don't wait. Create, contribute, speak, lead. The right people will notice. And the wrong ones will wish they had. Because just like Charlotte, you may find that the setback you feared most was the setup for something bigger than you imagined. Thank you for choosing to listen to this story among thousands of stories out there. Like and subscribe to continue listening to the latest stories.